The following is part of Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series under the Cornell East Asia Program. The arguments and viewpoints of this talk belong solely to the speaker. We hope you enjoy.
It's an honor and pleasure to speak to all of you today on Big Science with Chinese Characteristics. Actually, the initial title I submitted to Robin was called My Thoughts on Science with Chinese Characteristics for a New Era. As you might recognize, this is a play on the so-called Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. That's being written into the party charter and the constitution. Of course, I'm not authorized to think Xi Jinping thought, so I'm just here to share some of my thoughts on science in China. I would like to start this lecture with a question. Should liberal democracies have a technological advantage over authoritarian regimes? I ask this question because as a Chinese scientist studying and working in the United States, this is a question I've asked myself many times over the past 8 years. Whenever I see technological and scientific breakthroughs coming out of China, I view it with mixed emotions. The scientist in me am excited at the advancements in human understanding of nature. The citizen in me wonders how this technology would be used by an authoritarian regime, and what it might mean to the liberal democratic world order when a free world could no longer claim a technological advantage. This question has an increased urgency with the news coming out from the past couple of weeks, as Xi Jinping further consolidates power and indefinitely extends it as leader of the unfree world, while the free world appears leaderless. I would like you to keep this question on the back of your mind as we walk through the history and contemporary landscape of science in China. China, as home to one of the oldest civilizations in the world, had a splendid history, including in science and technology. However, it did lag behind the West since the time of the Enlightenment. As presented by 20th century British sinologist Joseph Needham as the so-called Needham's Grand Question, he said gunpowder, the magnetic compass, paper and printing, what Francis Bacon called the inventions that were most instrumental in bringing the West out of the Dark Ages, were invented in China. Then why did the modernization of science, the mathematization of the hypothesis about nature, and the technological advancements that come with it only happen in the West since the time of Galileo, but not in the Chinese civilization? The Needham question is hypothetical in nature, and there are many ways to answer it or challenge its premise. What is not a hypothesis is that China and the Chinese people paid a heavy price for its lagging behind in science and technology over several centuries, resulting in a devastating defeat at the First Opium Wars, leading to a century of humiliation that technically ended when Mao Zedong stood on the gate of heavenly peace and announced that the Chinese people have stood up at the founding of the People's Republic. Science in Mao's China largely mirrored the Soviet model, where the space and nuclear programs were given priority. The so-called 两弹一星, 2 bombs and 1 star, the 2 bombs referring to the atomic bomb and the ballistic missile, and 1 star referring to the man-made satellite. China successfully detonated its first atomic bomb in 1964 and its first man-made satellite 6 years later in 1970. It was named Dongfang Hong, the sun rises in the east. In the meantime, through the anti-rightist campaigns in the late 1950s to the decade of madness called the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, scientists were among the most persecuted groups in China through Mao's reign. Tragically and ironically, the veterans of the Chinese space and nuclear programs were not immune to political persecutions. The rebuild from the era of devastation of Mao's reign was difficult and urgent. In 1977, the so-called full modernization was enacted, referring to the modernization of agriculture, industry, national defense, science, and technology. 四个现代化, as it is called in Chinese, came to symbolize the time when Deng Xiaoping was the paramount leader in China. On March 3rd, 1986, 4 of China's top weapons scientists, all of them veterans of the Chinese space and nuclear program, wrote a private letter to Deng Xiaoping saying that China must join the 新技术革命, the new technological revolution. This moment came to be known as China's Sputnik moment, as they launched the so-called 863计划, Program 863, named after the date of the letter, or the National High-Tech R&D Program. It was followed a decade later by Program 973, again named after the date in spring of 1997, the National Program on Key Basic Research Project. In the meantime, there were also a number of university development plans that were put forth. Most notably, Project 211, which is named in a way to indicate build 100 universities successfully facing the 21st century. It started in 1995, enacted by Jiang Zemin. And a few years later, in May of 1998, the Project 985, which also identified a group of key universities to put resources in. I grew up on the campus of the University of Science and Technology of China as the daughter of a professor in mechanical science and engineering. And I remember as a little kid in the late 90s, hearing my parents say these obscure number combinations and sounding quite proud that their university is being selected for both programs. Both programs are now superseded by Xi Jinping's double first class, which means building first-class universities and first-class disciplines. And growing up, this line is passed down through generations. It traces back to the 1950s, so-called 学好数理化,走遍天下都不怕. Learn well math, physics, and chemistry, and you can walk around the world unafraid. 3 decades since China's Sputnik moment, the country has made remarkable progress in terms of science and technology. And I will use the next several minutes to walk through some of the key areas and highlight some recent breakthroughs. First is China's space program. As mentioned earlier, this is an area that was prioritized since the founding of the People's Republic. However, this is also an area that is extremely resource intensive and where the United States and Russia had a huge lead. In the fall of 2003, China launched its first crewed space mission with its first astronaut, Yang Liwei. I remember as a middle school student at the time, as cynical and hard to please teenagers, my classmates and I were wondering how much pride we could derive from this breakthrough when the United States and Russia have done this decades before. On the other hand, a decade and a half later, China is not only establishing itself as a player in space technology, but also becoming a leader in this field with its space stations and laboratory programs, so named Tiangong, Heavenly Palace. Its rocket systems are named Long March, after Mao's romanticized and propagandized massive military retreat during the Second World War, Changzheng, and the Long March 5 is the heavy load rockets that are going to propel these missions to the further end of the universe, including the far end of the moon, which has never been explored before, Mars missions, and beyond. In the meantime, China also has launched a number of ground-based astronomical and cosmological experiments, including telescope experiments, such as the 500-meter telescope experiment located in Guangxi province that's designed partly with a specific purpose to search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And the December issue of the Atlantic last year had a beautiful essay by Ross Anderson called "What if China Makes First Contact on the FAST Telescope?" So as mentioned, space technology is a field where it's resource intensive and China has been playing catch up. On the other hand, there are also other nascent technology fields where China can quickly establish itself as a player and become a leader. One of these fields is quantum technology. One of the Long March rockets launched into space the world's first quantum science experiment satellite in the summer of 2016, named after an ancient Chinese philosopher, Mozi, or Messias. And then a year later, summer of last year, it was reported that the first object was teleported from Earth to orbit. A photon was teleported from Earth and received by Mozi, the satellite. And then just a couple months ago, it was announced that the first quantum encrypted video conference was conducted across a significant breakthrough of distances between continents, in this case between China and Vienna in Austria. In the meantime, China is also constructing the world's largest quantum research facility. It's actually in my hometown of Hefei, Anhui, by a lake, and the construction cost is about $10 billion. And the idea is to consolidate the resources to achieve supremacy in terms of quantum computing, communications, and encryption. The lead scientist, Pan Jianwei, as he stated, the goal is to achieve quantum supremacy by 2020 or as early as 2018. Another field that China has been making strides in is biotechnology. As many of you have might read in the news a couple of months ago, Chinese scientists announced that they produced the world's first cloned primates through somatic cell nuclear transfer. These are the very adorable monkeys, and it was using the same technology that created Dolly the sheep 20 years ago. On the other hand, there is another phrase that might have been in the news for the past several years, the so-called Crispr gene editing technology, which is by far the cheapest and most powerful gene technology ever. And in the summer of 2015, Chinese scientists shocked the world by being the first in using CRISPR genome editing technology to edit human embryos. That experiment was not successful, but 2 years later, the first successful genome editing in human embryos was conducted by an international group of scientists from United States, South Korea, and China to fix a disease gene that would lead to heart disease. In the meantime, there are at least 9 ongoing clinical trials in China using CRISPR genome editing technology to treat cancer. On the other hand, due to a lot of ethical concerns and regulatory constraints, there is only one such clinical trial planned in the United States and just starting. When we think about quantum technology or biotechnology, these are the fields that have an explicit application values and might even sound a bit sci-fi-ish. And one might understand why China would want to make strides in it. On the other hand, I should also highlight that China is also making a lot of investments and progress in fundamental sciences and basic research. And one of these fields is my field of research, which is particle physics. There are a number of world-leading particle physics experiments located in China, including the Daya Bay neutrino experiment located at the Daya Bay nuclear reactor in Guangdong province. The Panda X dark matter direct detection experiment, which is located in Sichuan province in the world's deepest underground laboratory, 2.4 kilometers or 1.5 miles underground, using a giant xenon tank to try to detect dark matter particles that might have traveled through Earth. On the other hand, my specific field is collider particle physics. China has one particle collider, which is the Beijing Electron-Positron Collider. The project started in the late 1980s under explicit directives from Deng Xiaoping, at a time when the country was still very poor, but he thinks it's extremely important for China to become a player in collider particle physics. And being on this campus, I should also mention that the Beijing Electron-Positron Collider is very similar to the collider experiment that used to be here, the CSER Cornell Electron Storage Ring. And the main detector on the Beijing Electron-Positron Collider, the Beijing spectrometer, is also very similar to the CLEO experiment here. One of my college research supervisors, Professor Zhao Zhengguo, he actually worked here for quite a while and knows some of the folks at the physics department well. And he talked about back in the 80s as an ambitious young scientist, how he would use to rally his colleagues to write letters to Deng Xiaoping to ask him to support particle physics. On the other hand, China is putting forth an extremely ambitious plan to become the leader in collider particle physics within a generation. So the experiment I work on is the Large Hadron Collider, which is the biggest, most expensive, and most complicated machinery ever built, located at the Swiss-French borders, operated by the European Center for Nuclear Research, CERN. The LHC would reach its technological limits in about 20 years, so there would need to be a successor to it. And China is bidding to become the successor to build the future super collider, a 100-kilometer tunnel with about 6 times the energy of the current LHC. And one proposed site is at Qinhuangdao, just outside of Beijing, where the Great Wall meets the sea. China's advances in science and technology is getting noticed. If you flip through newspapers, whether in the United States or Europe these days, almost every week you're going to see a headline talking about China's breathtaking breakthroughs and becoming a scientific superpower. Some reporters or analysts might even think that America is already yielding its throne as the leader in global science and yielding the leadership to China. The Economist, interestingly, ran this editorial earlier this year, arguing that the next super collider should be built in China. Some of my colleagues are very much welcoming me the idea, as one of the quotes from Peter Yangyang, who is known as the father of the two largest experiments on the Large Hadron Collider, a 70-year-old Swiss scientist who said, if I were younger, I can totally see myself working in China. But if you read the rest of his quote, you could see that this enthusiasm is on one hand understandable and admirable, but it's also deeply rooted in a sense of ignorance and naivete about China, its science, and its political landscape. So science in China has made a lot of progress, but it also has a lot of problems. Some of the problems are easy to spot and are getting attention. For example, the poorly advised incentive systems. There are these, even this is not just at medium level or universities, but even top universities have these kinds of incentive systems where they will give cash rewards to papers published. The better the journal, the more the money. And also, there are poorly enforced ethical standards that could lead to massive academic fraud. According to a New York Times report recently, since 2012, China has retracted more scientific papers because of faked peer reviews than all of the other countries combined. This has been getting attention within China with Chinese authorities as well, as the Chinese Ministry of Science and Technology said in last summer that this academic fraud has, quote, seriously harmed the international reputation of our country's scientific research and the dignity of Chinese scientists at large. No one would think about it, right? Why would it vows to crack down on academic fraud? But China is so good at censorship and cracking down on any kind of political dissent. Why wouldn't it be able to crack down on academic fraud or let it exist in the first place? As late as the late 2010, only about half of Chinese hospitals and health ministries at the municipal level have ethical boards. But every work unit, lab, school, hospital has a Communist Party branch. These issues with poorly advised incentive systems or academic fraud are only the symptoms, not the disease. If one truly wants to understand the flaws with science in China, one needs to go to its political ideology and its political system itself. Astronomy is an area that developed in ancient China since imperial times, with the first recordings of lunar and solar eclipses recorded on oracle bones. However, astronomy developed in imperial China not primarily for the purpose of navigation, as an Eurocentric perspective might suggest. On the other hand, it is used to justify imperial rule, 君权神授, as if the movement of the stars somehow is a divine indication of the emperor's rule. I think one should always be careful in drawing from Chinese history and ancient culture to understand contemporary China, because the current Chinese party state is very much more a Soviet import than an imperial heritage. However, I mentioned a specific example of astronomy in imperial China because there is a direct analogy to communism. Communism is a political ideology that purports objectivity and the scientific method. But it does so in order to justify its power and demand obedience. If a government is scientific, and if science is the one and only truth, then this government's hold on power must be as undefiable and absolute as the laws of the universe, or so as the ideology goes. And this kind of ideology doesn't actually respect science and actually sees itself as the paramount power above the laws of the universe. One example is after the nuclear reactor accident at Chernobyl in the former Soviet Union 30 years ago. The local political officers were asking the people that they have to win this struggle, this fight against the atom, the universe, physics itself. They were boasting that the red flag was flying over the fourth reactor just 4 days after the catastrophe. Of course, the laws of the universe cannot be defied, and the flag was quickly destroyed by radiation. And so the flags were constantly being replaced by human beings at great personal cost. And ironically, the reward to the workers who were asked to replace the red flag above the flaming radioactive reactor was Pepsi. When a political ideology takes the shape of an authoritarian regime, it weaponizes the sense of patriotism as a tool of control. This parochial nationalism is antithetical to the cosmopolitan ideals of science. Here we see a picture of two dashing young men. The one on the left is Chen Yangyang, who happened to be from my hometown of Hefei, Anhui, and I went to the same high school as he did, and I should emphasize, not at the same time. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1948 as a student of Edward Teller and Enrico Fermi. He spent most of his professional career in the United States, later going on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics, and was the young in the groundbreaking Yang-Mills theory. The one on the right was his best friend since adolescence, a man by the name of Deng Jiaxian. A couple years younger, Deng received his PhD from Purdue University in 1950. He boarded a boat back to China 9 days after his PhD graduation to devote himself to the scientific enterprise of the new China. He later became the father of the Chinese nuclear weapons program. Growing up, both Yang and Deng were household names, and I was always told that Deng was the superior scientist. Unlike Yang, he did not make significant contributions to advancing human understanding of nature. But what I was told was that Deng's science served a higher purpose, that in defense of one's nation and one's people. What was lost in this patriotic propaganda was the ethical debate behind Deng's actions itself. Why would a scientist choose to build bombs, build the most powerful weapons on Earth, for a regime that has killed more of its own people than any foreign invaders in history? Why would a scientist choose to make weapons at all? In our middle school history textbooks, we learned that going from the atomic bomb to the hydrogen bomb, it took the Americans 7 years. It took the Soviets less than 4 years. It took the Chinese 2 years and 8 months. The idea that China was able to build the bombs faster, albeit not the first, was supposed to be a sign of the superiority of the Chinese science and in turn the superiority of the Chinese state. And again, in this kind of debate, it doesn't leave room for any ethical considerations. A more recent example is with these cloned monkeys. They are named Zhongzhong and Huahua, where Zhonghua means the Chinese nation and people. They were not just the products of science. They were the products of Chinese science. If we think back at Dolly the sheep, born in Scotland 20 years ago, her name had bared no reference to British monarchs or Scottish kings, but rather was a cheeky reference to the American country singer Dolly Parton and her well-endowed figure. The Chinese party state constantly invokes the sense of patriotism in its scientific endeavors. One thing it's trying to do is to recruit scientists from overseas to return to China to work. My undergraduate research supervisor, whom I mentioned earlier, Zhao Zhengguo, so he was among the first of the so-called 1,000 talent plan, recruited back to China from the University of Michigan in the summer of 2008. If we look at the English language website for China's 1,000 talent plan, the banner in black reads, "Welcome overseas high-level talent to come back to China." And then in parentheses, "come to China to do innovative and enterprising work." However, in larger font and in red, it reads, 祖国 needs you, 祖国 welcomes you, 祖国 places her hope in you. One would naturally think the subject here would be 中国, China, but it's not. It's 祖国, the motherland. The Chinese government is once again invoking a sense of blood and belonging. It's another reflection of how the government sees itself as not only controlling over a territory and a citizenry, but actually claiming ownership of a people, including its diaspora. The 1,000 Talent Plan does provide a number of tantalizing incentives to draw overseas talent. Some of these are more general, like funding lab space, staff, and student resources. On the other hand, there are also other incentives distinctively with Chinese characteristics, from housing vouchers to spousal settlement, and in particular, the Hukou guarantee. Hukou is China's notorious household registration system, which is basically a caste system with Chinese characteristics that determines where you can get any kind of social benefits, where your children can go to school, where you can buy apartments. And for these overseas returned high-level talent, they're guaranteed Beijing or Shanghai or these first-tier city Hukou, if that's where their institution is located. Many scientists of Chinese ethnicity did answer the call of the motherland. From earlier, the aforementioned Deng Jiaxian, the father of the Chinese nuclear weapons program, to the father of the Chinese space program, Qian Xuesen, who returned to China in the 1950s amidst the height of the McCarthy-era Red Scare, and he was actually accused of being a communist spy, placed under house arrest in the United States for an extended period of time before he was finally allowed to return to China. In the more contemporary era, the aforementioned several areas of science and technology where China has been leading, making great progress in, they're almost always led by an overseas returnee. The top quantum scientist in China is Pan Jianwei, who received his PhD from the University of Vienna. Wang Yifang, the director of the Institute of High Energy Physics in Beijing, who is spearheading the Super Collider plan, received his PhD from the University of Florence. The principal investigator on the experiment that cloned the monkey twins, Mu Mingpu, he was born in Hong Kong, emigrated to the US at a very young age, and until recently was a faculty member at UC Berkeley. I have great personal respect and professional respect for my colleagues who do answer the motherland's call and go back to China to work. And I believe their love for China is genuine, so is their curiosity in terms of exploring nature. However, one needs to understand that when one answers the call of the motherland and return to China, one is also subjecting themselves to the control of the Chinese Communist Party. Despite its market reforms and private enterprise, China remains a Leninist state, which means that the party controls everything. As evident from Xi Jinping's speech at the 19th People's Congress last fall, government, military, society, and schools, north, south, east, and west, the party is the leader of all. The party's control is only intensifying. Some of the news coming out from last fall was China's asking even foreign enterprises and multinational corporations, their China offices have to set up a Communist Party branch as well. And there is this almost comic news that Shanghai Resort's Communist Party chief held a study session of Xi Jinping thought and presented the speaker with a Mickey Mouse doll. And if we go to the website of the Institute of High Energy Physics at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, we could see that there is a specific section dedicated to party building. And one of these sections is the so-called related knowledge on the United Front. The United Front, the term first came from the Soviet era. It's called, Mao Zedong called United Front one of the three magic weapons, 三大法宝, the other two being armed struggle and party building. And the United Front is one of the ways the Chinese Communist Party exerts its influence and control. And if we read here, the ultimate goal is to win over hearts, act as a unifying force, and strive towards the grand goals of the party and the state. One of the targets of the United Front efforts is explicitly overseas returnees, as a separate document on the same site hosts the numbers of overseas returnees, their family members, their respective levels of employment. And this document is from almost 10 years ago. And this effort is only going to intensify as explicit directives from Xi Jinping since the last People's Congress. Some of my colleagues in the West don't necessarily understand what a Communist Party branch does. They ask me if it is just a formality. However, anyone who has an understanding of a Lenin state knows that the party branch is never just the figurehead. It's always the real boss. One example was last fall, I wrote an article for Foreign Policy magazine on the future super collider plan in China, for which I interviewed a high-level official at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And I asked him a very simple question, which made him extremely upset. I asked him, would there be a Communist Party branch at this future super collider? And he said, I only agreed to the interview because you said you're a scientist. Why are you stirring the pot? You are too young. This is too sensitive. It could destroy the project. Don't you dare kill my project. Science cannot be independent from politics if science is subject to politics. And what he is referring to, and which I understand very well, he kept saying, 自己回去想, go home and think about it why I'm saying this, is through the history of contemporary China, science was supported by the government when it serves a political purpose, but it can be crushed at any moment when it defies party doctrine, whether for ideological, professional, or personal reasons. The pseudoscience of traditional Chinese medicine is being supported because it serves a political purpose. On the other hand, astrophysics, a field as fundamental as astrophysics, was risky business in China through the 70s and 80s because it was said that the ideas of the formations of the universe runs counter to Marxist ideology. On the individual level, one of China's foremost astrophysicists, Fang Lizhi, his advocacy emerging as a leader of the democratic movement through 80s China not only led to his own demotion and eventual exile, but because he served as vice president of my undergraduate alma mater, University of Science and Technology of China, even years after Fang had left for the United States, the university suffered a political backlash and a reduction of funding. When the Chinese government supports science, it has an explicit goal when it sees science as a tool of national greatness. When Xi Jinping announced the Made in China 2025 plan, it is with an explicit goal not of possession of foreign technology, but internalization of it. A report from the Mercator Institute for China Studies warned that political economic decision makers should not be blindsided by the lucrative business opportunities that Made in China 2025 offer to foreign high-tech suppliers in China. They should be aware that China's long-term goal is to replace foreign with domestic technology. One great example is a story of two synchrotrons. This is the Australian synchrotron located just outside of Melbourne, and then the Shanghai synchrotron radiation facility. The two synchrotrons are almost identical in design. However, according to Professor Robert Rosner, who is the former director of Argonne National Laboratory, the Australian synchrotron, they imported every component from foreign firms because they were only interested in having a working synchrotron. However, at the Shanghai synchrotron, they imported one of everything and they replicated the rest because they were really intent on obtaining the technology. And it's not clear who actually obtained the technology, whether it's for civilian, commercial, or military use. Another anecdote I should mention is we could see that the outside architectural design, the Australian synchrotron is very plain, it's just a circle, while the Shanghai synchrotron is stunning. It is true that the Shanghai synchrotron the outside building was designed by a very famous architect. And when the blueprint was already approved, it was found that this building design, stunning from the outset, is actually not ideal for scientific experiments inside because it creates inconveniences to extract the beam from the synchrotron. However, the architecture cannot be changed because it was favored and approved by the local party boss. So the science just has to find its way to work around it. The so-called 师夷长技, to learn the advanced technologies from foreigners. This phrase was first coined by the Qing Dynasty scholar Wei Yuan, and the full sentence goes, 师夷长技以制夷, to learn the advanced technology from the foreigners in order to subdue them. The Chinese government has been pushing this notion of the so-called 军民融合, military-civilian fusion, and we should take the Chinese government at its word this time, that when it says so, we should assume that any technology acquired by the Chinese government would be dual use for both civilian and military means. And for an authoritarian state like China, any technology can be used for national defense could equally be used for its internal security. China is already using advanced technologies such as artificial intelligence, advanced surveillance and imaging tools to build these 21st century police states in its further west regions like Xinjiang province. And what happens in Xinjiang is only a testing ground, and what happens there would not be assumed to be contained there. There has been a number of really incredibly brave and stunning investigative journalism on the plight of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province and the overall so-called digital Leninism, the kind of social control aided by new technology. Another thing I should mention is the advances of biotechnology in China. China is already collecting massive amounts of biometrics information, including DNA information from residents in Xinjiang, masked as mandatory health checkups. And this is one of the things that actually keeps me up at night. When I think about this is a state that has used extremely crude measures, such as forced abortions and forced sterilizations for population control and massive social engineering. It's a state that has written eugenics into the law. What is it going to be able to do with advanced biotechnology, including genome editing? The new advances in biotechnology would become a powerful tool in the Chinese security and surveillance state. And in the worst nightmares, it could become a weapon of genocide. The potential military applications for these new technologies is rightfully getting attention outside of China, rattling quite a few feathers in DC. There has been a flurry of news coming out from DC over the past several months. Both the legislative and executive branches are considering using different measures to put barriers in terms of Chinese investment in US high-tech firms or technological transfer from the United States to China. The FBI director, Christopher Wray, made a shocking claim a couple weeks ago, basically saying that Chinese students and scientists are taking advantage of the open academic environment in the United States to steal technology and act as agents of the Chinese state. Ian Bremmer and the Eurasia Group listed as one of its top global risks for 2018, a global tech Cold War. This is a point where I would like to return to my opening question. Should liberal democracies have a technological advantage over authoritarian regimes? If we think about the development and application of technology, it's a reflection of the society and the values it is created in. Then the idea of the free world losing its technological advantage is a frightening one. The analogy is not quite what if Hitler had acquired a bomb first, but what if China had invented the internet? Would the internet still be a platform for the free exchange of ideas, or would it become a tool of state control and surveillance? Would the internet be invented at all? I asked this question once last December when my graduate school alma mater, the University of Chicago, commemorated the 75th anniversary of the first self-sustained controlled nuclear chain reaction. It was achieved on the campus of the University of Chicago on December 2nd, 1942, in the beginning of the Manhattan Project. The experiment was led by a group of scientists, many of them refugees who fled Europe amid rising anti-Semitism. They were refugee scientists who were embraced by America and who joined a war against their home countries that denied their humanity. The story at the dawn of the nuclear age, told in a certain way, could be an ode to American exceptionalism. As told by the head of the Manhattan Project during the Second World War, General Leslie Groves. When Manhattan Project scientist and then chair of the physics department at the University of Chicago, Arthur Compton, asked General Groves this question, if he would ever put the welfare of the United States above the welfare of mankind. General Groves said, if you put it that way, you have to put the welfare of mankind first. But show me, if you can, an agency through which it is possible to do more for the service of man than can be done through the United States. The sentiment expressed by General Groves was echoed by Arthur Compton himself, who wrote in his memoir, Atomic Quest, how he believed the United States has to organize and lead an effective world police and to keep weapons of mass destruction out of the hands of authoritarian regimes. But is the world really this simple? Is the United States really almighty? When the bomb invention was imminent, the Manhattan Project commissioned a group of scientists at the University of Chicago, led by UChicago physicist James Franck, to advise on whether or not to use this new weapon in war. The Franck report advised against its usage and made this warning. It may be asked whether we cannot achieve monopoly on the raw materials of nuclear power. One could further ask whether we cannot feel ourselves safe in the race of nuclear armaments by virtue of our greater industrial potential, including greater diffusion of scientific and technical knowledge. The Franck report, which was published in June 11th of 1945, its suggestion of not using an atomic bomb was not adopted. The rest was history, but its prediction of a proved prescient, as the United States was not able to keep nuclear technology to itself, and the arms race during the Cold War brought the world to the brink of nuclear Armageddon multiple times. And also, it significantly weakened the US's own democratic institutions. From the expansion of executive power, Congress has not formally declared war since the United States acquired nuclear weapons, saying that it needs quick executive action with these kinds of powerful tools, and also the buildup of a massive security state. The co-inventor of the first nuclear reactor, Leo Szilard, said, the most powerful weapon coming out of the Manhattan Project was not the atomic bomb, but the secret stamp. The United States cannot have its monopoly on technology, nor could any entity. In April of 2011, Congress passed a resolution banning NASA from engaging in bilateral agreements and coordination from China. But it has not stopped the Chinese space program. On the other hand, China has its space program continues with increased collaboration with EU and Russia. First of all, no country can have a monopoly on any branch of science or any technology. On the other hand, when President Obama said in his first inaugural address, "As for our common defense, we reject as false the choice between our safety and our ideals," no one should make false equivalencies between liberal democracies and authoritarian states. But belief in liberal democratic values should not become blind faith in its omnipotence or infallibility. The United States also abuses its technology, from surveillance to extrajudicial killings to, as Daniel Golden, author of Spy School, said, the US intelligence agencies also actively tries to infiltrate academic circles for intelligence gathering. When the United States betrays its liberal democratic values in a self-purported arms race, it not only hurts its own credibility on the global stage, it also makes itself less democratic and more authoritarian. At the end of the day, when we think about these new technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence, biotech, or anything on the horizon, its innate risk is not a derivative of and cannot be masked by its nature of ownership. A tech race squeezes out the space for an ethical debate, reduces the transparency, and actually makes everyone less safe and less free. So, how should the global science community engage with China? There has been a lot of reckoning among China watchers or policymakers in the West these days, saying how the West has gotten China wrong. When we thought when China opened up its markets 4 decades ago, when China joined the WTO a decade and a half ago, if there is free choice of Starbucks coffee, China is going to want free choice of political parties. It did not happen. And my own argument on this is the global community has often underestimated its power and influence, but overestimated its commitment to values. It's easy to say, oh, China's often insular scientific world will be cracked open by an infusion of foreign physicists, as The Economist wrote in its argument why the next super collider should be built in China. This kind of view is almost neo-colonial, to think that it will be just like knights in shiny armor coming to China and opening it up. However, when it really comes to occasions where one needs to defend basic principles of freedom, independence, and transparency, Western participants on the Chinese sphere, whether it's science or business, are often willing to curb its own standards in order to meet Chinese government requests. The internet is not free in China. When nor at any of its scientific experiments with the global collaboration, when I asked my colleagues in the West whether or not they would demand, for example, if China builds the next super collider, it needs to provide the free internet, they tell me that they are not as dependent on Facebook or Twitter and will be okay with it as long as China provides free stream of data from the experiments. And it's not unusual that scientists and technologists can be blinded by a technological arrogance and think that democracy and democratic institutions can almost be a hindrance. For example, when Nima Akani Hamed, who is the founding director of China's Center for Future Particle Physics and the most prominent non-Chinese face for China's super collider plan, told me that democratic systems make it harder to do long-term things, and the top-down system of China can be more efficient in decision-making. One really needs to question how much Western scientists saying that these scientific collaboration with China will be a beacon of hope and open window are really committed to these liberal democratic values, when I'm being constantly asked, what is your priority, science or human rights, as if these are mutually exclusive. I would like to tell a story of two publishers. Last summer, Cambridge University Press announced that it had responded to Chinese government's request to censor over 300 journal articles from its China Quarterly Journal in order to meet the Chinese government's censorship requests. It instigated a giant uproar from the academic community, including threats of boycott. Cambridge University Press quickly backed down and put these censored articles back online. However, later in the year, Springer Nature, the world's largest academic publishing firm, blocked at least 1,000 articles per China's request. And this is an initial estimation. It's actually estimated to be much greater at the percent level of Springer's entire archive. And in this case, Springer is not only passively responding to China's censorship requests, but is actively participating in the Chinese government's propaganda machine, including obtaining the English translation rights of Xi Jinping's new book and signing scientific partnerships with Chinese technological firms. Springer Nature has also put forth advertisements in simplified Chinese, hence targeting an audience in mainland China, asking Chinese scholars in geography and history to use Springer's global platform to put forward its research. There is nothing inherently wrong with having more Chinese scientists and scholars having their work being presented on the global stage. But one needs to understand that subjects such as geography and history are heavily censored and essentially an arm of the Chinese government propaganda. And it's now going to be aided by Springer's global platform. I would like to conclude by going over what we talked about today. We know that China has made great progress in science, but it has its strength, and we should acknowledge that. But it also has a lot of challenges, Some of these issues are managerial and easier to fix, but the deeper structural flaws are rooted in its political system and ideology. Nature is not political, but science as a human enterprise, especially as a primarily government-funded enterprise, is, and no one should kid themselves otherwise. When we face China's rise in science technology, the West first should overcome its neo-colonial prejudices, whether or not the Chinese people can do science, or whether or not it can simply change China through a scientific experiment. What it should do is strengthen its own commitment to education and research if it's not only good for its own national security, and it's good for science globally, that any country should be committed to it, because no entity can have monopoly on science. If we simply buy into a dichotomy of a Cold War mindset, it makes everyone less safe and less free. It would be incredibly tragic if, in order to win a tech race with an authoritarian regime, the free world becomes more authoritarian in the meantime. China's rise is not a reason to doubt liberal democracy, but it does present an urgency to defend it. And I would like to conclude this lecture with two messages. The first message is to citizens of the free world. What do you value? The global community should not seclude China. It should engage China, but the engagement must be conditioned on principles of transparency, independence, and freedom of inquiry. It does carry a certain level of professional personal risk, but principles are only empty slogans unless one takes the risks to defend them. And then to the people of China, I ask, what do you deserve? There are no perfect dichotomy of the oppressor and the victim in an authoritarian regime. The people contribute to their own oppression by keeping their head down, keeping their mouths shut, becoming obedient, and taking temporary personal comfort and hence becoming complicit in the system. When I spoke with a senior Chinese Academy of Sciences official on the Super Collider project, I left that conversation with a deep sense of sadness. For someone of his generation who came of age during the Cultural Revolution, who saw the remarkable transformation of China and the world. For someone as bold and ambitious as himself, who has the grand vision of building an 100-kilometer tunnel in the mountains at the foot of the Great Wall to create an experiment tens of billions of dollars in value with technology that doesn't yet exist, to smash particles at nearly the speed of light to recreate the split second at the creation of the universe, with technology that doesn't yet exist, which means this is an experiment that is not for the next year, next 5 years, or next decade. It's for the next 30 years to next half a century. In that audacious and long-term vision, he could not see one of a lab free from a Communist Party branch, let alone a free China. And I think that is the ultimate tragedy. No matter how high the red flag flies, communist ideology is not above the laws of nature. Whatever the Chinese government tries to tell the world, that the Chinese people are somehow unique and democracy doesn't apply to them. We know that there are certain values and certain principles that are as universal as the fundamental forces that bind us and our shared cosmological history. Thank you very much.